The morning of my wedding, a sheriff's deputy knocked on the door of my bridal suite at the Harrington Hotel in Savannah, Georgia, and handed me a restraining order filed by my future mother-in-law. Her name was Patricia Voss. The document said I was a danger to her son. It said I had a history of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation. It said the court should prevent me from appearing at the ceremony scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon at Forsyth Park. The ink was still fresh. She had filed it at 7 in the morning. I stood in the doorway of room 412 in my robe with my hair half done and my maid of honor's curling iron still running on the bathroom counter, and I read every word. Then I handed the document to my attorney, who had driven down from Atlanta the night before, not for the wedding, but because I had asked her to be present. Because I had known something was coming. I just hadn't known it would be a restraining order. The judge dismissed it in 4 minutes. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. But let me take you back to where this really started, because a restraining order on a wedding morning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is the last move of a woman who has run out of every other option and knows it. And to understand what Patricia Voss ran out of, you have to understand what she was trying to protect. And to understand that, you have to understand what she spent 3 years trying to destroy. Which is me. My name is Mara Delacroix. I am 34 years old. I was raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, by my grandmother, Celestine Delacroix, who worked 31 years as a hospital administrator at Our Lady of the Lake Regional Medical Center, retired at 67, and died when I was 26 with the most organized estate I have ever seen in my professional life. I say professional life because I am an estate and trust attorney. The irony is not lost on me. Celestine left me 2 things, a duplex on Oleander Street that brought in $1,100 a month in rental income, and a trust account with a balance of $412,000, structured with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything she ever did. The trust had one condition: the funds were to be distributed to me upon my marriage or my 35th birthday, whichever came first. I was 31 when I met Daniel Voss. I want to be precise about Daniel, because this story is not about him being a villain. It isn't. Daniel Voss is a 36-year-old civil engineer who grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house where his mother made every decision, from what he ate for breakfast to which college he attended to which friends were acceptable and which were quietly discouraged. He is kind. He is patient. He is the kind of man who keeps his word and opens doors and remembers exactly how you take your coffee. He is also a man who spent the first 33 years of his life orbiting a woman who treated his autonomy as a personal inconvenience. I didn't understand the full scope of that when I met him. I learned it the slow, methodical way, the same way I learn everything. We met at a conference in Charleston. He was presenting on infrastructure load calculations. I was there for a continuing legal education panel on estate planning across state lines. We ended up at the same table at a dinner neither of us particularly wanted to attend, and we talked until the venue staff started stacking chairs around us. He called me the next morning. We were long distance for 8 months, Atlanta to Charleston, before he relocated to take a position with a firm in Atlanta. 14 months after that, he proposed in my grandmother's garden on Oleander Street, under the fig tree Celestine had planted the year I was born. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I met Patricia Voss 6 weeks after we started dating. Daniel drove me to Charleston for a Sunday dinner, and he was quiet in the car in a way I noticed but didn't yet know how to read. The house was large and carefully maintained, a colonial revival on a tree-lined street in the Wagoner Terrace neighborhood, the kind of house that announces itself. Patricia met us at the door before we'd reached the porch steps. She was 62, immaculately dressed for a Sunday dinner at home, hair set, lipstick perfect, and she looked at me the way a woman looks at something that has appeared in a room where she didn't leave a door open. She hugged Daniel for a long time. Then she turned to me and smiled with her mouth. "Daniel tells me you're an attorney," she said. "Estate planning. Trusts and wills." I said yes. "Practical," she said. Then she walked back inside, and I stood on the porch a half-second longer than necessary, processing the specific weight of that word. Practical. Not impressive. Not interesting. Practical. Like I was a filing system Daniel had acquired. Dinner was a performance. Patricia had cooked an elaborate meal, 3 courses, the good china, candles on a Sunday, and she directed the conversation the way a conductor directs an orchestra. Every subject introduced and concluded on her timeline. Every silence filled before it could belong to someone else. She asked me questions that were not questions. You must work long hours. It must be hard to maintain relationships in your field. Do you see yourself staying in Atlanta long term? Each one a small stone placed carefully in front of a path. I answered them without moving off the path. I had taken depositions with men twice her age who were better at this than she was. Driving back to Atlanta that night, Daniel was quiet again. I finally asked. She doesn't like me. He was quiet for another mile. She doesn't know you yet. That's not the same thing, I said. He looked at the road. I know. I waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. I made a mental note of the shape of that silence and filed it away. Over the next year, I documented 3 things about Patricia Voss with the same precision I applied to client files. First, she called Daniel every day, sometimes twice. Not to check in, to manage. The calls were operational. Did you schedule the car service? Did you call your uncle back? Are you eating properly? The content of a mother managing a teenager, delivered to a 34-year-old man who held a professional engineering license. Second, every time Daniel and I made a decision together, where to spend a holiday, whether to adopt a dog, which neighborhood to look at for a house, Patricia found out within 48 hours and offered a counterpoint. Not a suggestion. A counterpoint. Delivered with the authority of someone who considered her input a required step in the process. Third, my trust fund. I don't know exactly when Patricia learned about my grandmother's trust. I know Daniel told her at some point, because Daniel tells his mother things in the way of someone who has been trained since childhood that information belongs to her. I don't blame him for it. It was the water he grew up in. But I noticed the shift in how Patricia treated the subject of our finances after that point. She began asking questions about timelines. When are you two thinking about a house? Have you talked about combining finances? She asked Daniel once, in front of me, whether it made sense for him to be on the deed if they bought property before they were married. I watched Daniel nod like that was a reasonable thing for his mother to say about his 32-year-old girlfriend's assets. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened a blank document and titled it, Notes, Patricia Voss. I wrote down the question, the date, and the context. I didn't know yet what I was building. I just knew I was an estate attorney, and I had learned from 2 decades of watching families fracture that the moments you don't write down are the ones you can never prove. The first direct move came 11 months before the wedding. Daniel and I had gotten engaged 4 months earlier. The planning was underway, venue secured, date set, Savannah in late October because I had loved that city since a trip I took at 23, and Daniel had agreed immediately with the enthusiasm of a man who understood that some decisions are not negotiations. Patricia called me directly for the first time. Not Daniel. Me. She said she wanted to discuss the financial arrangements for the wedding. I told her Daniel and I were handling the finances ourselves. She said she understood that, but she had some concerns about the structure of the trust and how it might affect certain decisions going forward. I held the phone very still. What concerns, specifically? I asked. She said she'd spoken to an attorney. She said it casually, like mentioning she'd called the dry cleaner, and there were questions about whether a trust structured the way mine was could be considered a marital asset depending on the state. I waited 3 full seconds before I responded. I told her that was an interesting observation and that I would take it under advisement. Then I ended the call. Then I opened my notes document and wrote down every word she had said, verbatim, with the time and date. She had consulted an attorney about my trust fund before we were married. She was exploring whether she could position a claim on my grandmother's estate. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I wrote that down. My grandmother Celestine had worked 31 years in a hospital. She had driven herself to and from work in the same Honda Accord for 11 years. She had clipped grocery coupons and kept meticulous household ledgers and built $412,000 from a salary that never exceeded $68,000 a year, because she believed that the most important thing she could give me was options. And a woman I had met 8 times was talking to attorneys about it. I kept building the file. The campaign accelerated in the 8 months before the wedding. In December, Patricia told Daniel that she was worried about my work schedule, that I seemed consumed by my career in a way that concerned her for their future family life. She had never once asked me about my work schedule. In January, she told a mutual friend of Daniel's family that she had heard I had a difficult relationship with my own family, implying instability. My parents died in a car accident when I was 9 years old. My grandmother raised me. I had no difficult relationship with anyone. I had a grief I had managed quietly for 25 years. In February, Patricia told Daniel that she'd done some research and had concerns about the Savannah venue. She'd heard from someone that the catering was unreliable, and wouldn't it be better to have the wedding in Charleston where she could help manage things? Daniel mentioned this to me over dinner one evening in the mild way of a man passing along information he hasn't fully processed. I asked him who specifically she had heard from. He didn't know. I asked him if we could get a name so I could follow up with the venue. He said he'd ask. She didn't have a name. There was no one. The concern was invented. I added it to the file. In March, 6 months before the wedding, Patricia called Daniel and told him she had serious concerns about his financial future. She said she'd been speaking with her own financial planner, and she believed Daniel should have a prenuptial agreement. Daniel came to me that evening and sat down at the kitchen table with the careful posture of a man who has been handed something heavy and hasn't figured out where to put it. "My mother thinks we should consider a prenup," he said. I looked at him for a moment. I asked him what he thought. He said he wasn't sure. I asked him what specifically his mother was concerned about. He said she thought the trust structure was complicated and that there should be clear documentation of separate property going in. I nodded slowly. I told him that was actually a reasonable legal position and that I would be happy to draft the agreement myself since I was the one with the relevant expertise. I also told him that any prenuptial agreement I drafted would be reciprocal, it would protect my separate property and his. That my trust would remain mine, fully, and that anything we built together after the wedding would belong to both of us equally. He looked slightly relieved. He said that sounded fair. I said I thought so too. The prenuptial agreement was drafted and signed 6 weeks later. I had a colleague in Atlanta review it independently to ensure there was no conflict of interest argument. It was clean, clear, and thoroughly documented. My trust was mine. Full stop. I filed a copy in the notes document folder. 2 days after the prenup was signed, Patricia called Daniel and told him she was worried that I had rushed him into signing a legal document without adequate time to consider it. He had had 6 weeks and independent legal counsel. I added it to the file. August. 2 months before the wedding. I was sitting in my office on a Tuesday afternoon when my paralegal, Renata, knocked and said I had a call from a woman named Patricia Voss who said she was the mother of my fiancé and that it was important. I picked up. Patricia's voice was different this time. Not the managed brightness she usually deployed. Something flatter. More direct. She said she needed to talk to me privately about some things she had learned. I asked her what things. She said she had spoken to people who knew me from my time at the firm I'd worked at before starting my own practice. She said she'd heard that I had been involved in some professional disputes. She said she was concerned about Daniel's reputation being affected by association. I held my pen very still over my legal pad. I asked her who she had spoken to. She said she'd rather not say. I asked her what specifically she had heard. She described, in vague but pointed terms, something that sounded like an allegation of professional misconduct, something about the mishandling of a client estate. There had been no such incident. My record with the Georgia State Bar was completely clean. I had never had a complaint filed against me. I asked Patricia, calmly, whether she had verified this information with the bar directly. She said she hadn't felt that was necessary given the source. I said that it would be necessary before repeating it to anyone, because what she was describing was defamatory and I would treat it as such. The call ended shortly after. I sat in my office for 10 minutes after I hung up. Then I called the Georgia State Bar, obtained written confirmation of my clean record, and added both Patricia's call notes and the bar letter to the file. Then I called my attorney, Simone Arsenault, whom I had known since law school and trusted completely. I told her what was happening. I read her 3 months of notes. There was a long pause on the line. "Mara," she said. "What is her end game?" I said carefully, that she is trying to stop the wedding. And I think she's escalating because everything she's tried so far hasn't worked. Simone was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "But I think you should have me in Savannah. Just in case." I agreed. I booked her a room at the Harrington. I did not tell Daniel about the August call immediately. I wanted to think carefully about how. Daniel loved his mother in the complicated, load-bearing way of someone who has never been given permission to put the weight down. Every time I had raised a concern about Patricia, he had listened, and then he had done the thing people do when they love someone and can't yet see what they need to see. He had found a way to reframe it. "She's just worried. She's old-fashioned. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I understood this. I did not resent him for it. But I had also learned by now that the only evidence Daniel could truly absorb was evidence he couldn't reframe. So I was building toward that. I was building a file that would be undeniable. I just needed to give it a little more time. September. 5 weeks before the wedding. Patricia called Daniel, not me this time, and told him she had spoken to a therapist, her own therapist, who had expressed concerns, based on what Patricia had shared, that I might have certain personality traits that could make a marriage difficult. She did not name the traits specifically. She said the therapist had used clinical language she didn't want to repeat out of context. Daniel came to me that evening and told me about the call, and for the first time I saw something shift in his face. Not belief exactly, but fracture. The first small crack. He said, "I know it's my mother, but she seemed genuinely scared." I was quiet for a moment. Then I asked him to sit down. I opened my laptop. I showed him the file. I walked him through it methodically, the way I would walk a client through a case. Every incident in order, dated, with context. The call about the trust. The invented venue complaint. The prenuptial pressure. The fabricated professional allegation and the bar letter confirming it was false. The therapist claim. Daniel read each entry without speaking. When he finally looked up, his face had the particular expression of a man who has just understood something he has been not understanding for a very long time. "She's been doing this our whole relationship," he said. I waited. "Yes," I said. He was quiet again. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I did," I said gently. "You weren't ready to hear it yet." "That's not a criticism. It's just true." He sat with that. Then he asked me what we should do. I told him that was up to him to decide in terms of his relationship with his mother. But that I needed him to know what the file contained, and I needed him to understand that if something further came, I would treat it as what it was. He asked what that meant. I said I didn't know yet. But I was prepared. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel called Patricia and told her directly that he was marrying me on October 19th in Savannah and that her attendance was welcome but her interference was over. I wasn't on that call. He made it alone. He told me afterward that she had cried, that she had accused him of choosing a stranger over his family, that she had said she hoped he understood what he was giving up. He told me his voice had stayed steady the whole time. He said it was the hardest conversation he'd ever had. I held his hand and believed him. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the call had been the line she needed to see drawn. I underestimated her. The week before the wedding, Patricia called 3 of Daniel's closest friends, men who had been asked to serve as groomsmen, and told each of them separately that she had serious concerns about my financial motives. She said she believed I was marrying Daniel to access resources and that she had documentation. There was no documentation. She did not show them anything. She was counting on the word of a mother to do the work that evidence was supposed to do. 2 of the 3 men called Daniel immediately to tell him about the calls. The third, a man named Curtis, who had known Daniel since college and who had always been closer to the Voss family than to their relationship, did not call. I added Patricia's calls to the file. I made a note about Curtis. October 17th. 2 days before the wedding. I flew to Savannah. Simone drove down from Atlanta. We had dinner in the hotel restaurant that night and she reviewed the full file, every page, every date. She had a yellow legal pad and she took notes. When she finished, she set her pen down and looked at me. "This is thorough, Mara." "I know," I said. "If she does anything else," I said, "and the anything else has a legal dimension, I need to be able to respond immediately." "What kind of anything else are you thinking?" I looked at my wine glass. "I don't know exactly," I said. "But she's been building towards something. Whatever it is, it'll come fast and it'll come at a moment designed for maximum disruption." Simone nodded. "Then, I'll be here. Whatever she does, we'll handle it. We always do." October 18th. The night before the wedding. The rehearsal dinner at a restaurant on Drayton Street, 22 people, candlelight, low music, the warm particular feeling of a life coming together in a room. Patricia was there. She had come. She sat at the far end of the table in a yellow dress and she smiled when smiled at and she said appropriate things and she clinked glasses and she hugged Daniel with both arms when she arrived. I watched her the way I watch everything that requires watching, without appearing to watch. Across the table, Daniel's father, a quiet man named Robert who had said almost nothing to me in 3 years but whose eyes tracked everything, caught my gaze once and held it for just a moment. He had the look of a man who knows what is happening in his own house and is ashamed of it and has no idea how to stop it. I gave him the smallest nod I had. He looked away. I went to bed at 10:30. I slept 6 hours. I woke at 5:15, before my alarm, and lay in the dark listening to the Savannah quiet, the particular stillness of a low-country morning before the birds start. I was calm. I was always calm before things. My grandmother had made me that way, or perhaps she had simply recognized it in me and cultivated it. Either way, I lay in the dark and thought about Celestine, about the fig tree on Oleander Street, about her handwriting on the trust documents, careful and precise. I thought about what she would say if she were here. I thought she would say, "You have done everything right. Now let it be done." At 6:45, someone knocked on the door of room 412. I opened the door still in my robe. The deputy was young, maybe 26, with the careful expressionless face of someone trained to deliver uncomfortable things to people on significant days. He asked if I was Mara Delacroix. I said yes. He handed me the envelope, said I had been served, and walked back down the hallway without looking at me again. I stood in the doorway and opened it. The document was 4 pages. It had been filed at the Chatham County Superior Court at 7:03 that morning under an emergency petition for a temporary protective order. The petitioner was Patricia Voss. The respondent was me. The stated grounds were a pattern of emotional manipulation, financial coercion, and credible threat to the physical and psychological well-being of Daniel Robert Voss. It cited, as supporting evidence, a sworn affidavit from Patricia describing incidents she claimed to have witnessed or been told about over the course of 3 years. It also cited a supporting affidavit from a witness. The witness was Curtis. I read the document twice, standing in the doorway. Then I closed the door, set the papers on the desk, and called Simone. She picked up on the second ring. She was already awake. I read her the case number and the filing time. There was a brief silence. Then she said, "I'll be at your door in 10 minutes. I said, "Bring the file." My maid of honor, Destiny, was sitting on the bed watching me with the careful stillness of a woman who has been my closest friend for 11 years and knows that when I go quiet it means I am thinking, not falling apart. She asked me what it was. I told her. She said one word, very quietly, that I will not repeat here. Then she stood up, handed me my coffee, and said, "What do you need me to do?" I told her to keep getting ready. The wedding was still happening. She nodded like that was the most natural thing I could have said and picked up the curling iron. Simone arrived in 9 minutes. She sat at the desk and read every page of the petition. I watched her face. Simone Arsenault has been practicing law for 12 years. She does not react to documents. She reads them. But when she got to Curtis's affidavit, something moved briefly behind her eyes. She set the papers down. She looked at me. "This was filed at 7 this morning," she said. "The ceremony is at 2. She needs a judge to grant the TRO before 2 o'clock or it means nothing." I said I know. She said, "Do you know which judge is on emergency duty today?" I said I had checked the Chatham County Court calendar 2 days ago, because I am an attorney and I was in Savannah with a woman who I knew was capable of something, and the on-call emergency judge that Saturday was the Honorable Reginald Beaumont, who had been on the Chatham County bench for 19 years and was widely regarded as one of the most procedurally exacting jurists in the state of Georgia. Simone looked at me for a moment. "You checked the duty judge," she said. 2 days ago." I said yes. She said, "Open the file." We worked for 45 minutes at the desk in room 412 while Destiny did her hair in the bathroom and the October Savannah morning came through the window golden clean. Simone drafted a response to the petition. I walked her through the file section by section, every dated entry, every piece of documentation, the bar clearance letter, the prenuptial agreement, the 2 groomsmen's accounts of Patricia's calls the previous week. Simone wrote quickly on her yellow legal pad, building the counter-narrative the way a good attorney builds anything, from the ground up, fact by fact, with nothing decorative and nothing left to interpretation. At 8:50, Simone called the Chatham County Clerk's office. The emergency petition had been accepted and a hearing was scheduled for 10:30 at the courthouse on Montgomery Street. If Judge Beaumont granted the TRO, I would be legally prohibited from attending my own wedding. If he denied it, Patricia would have spent her last card. Simone put on her jacket. I put on mine. Destiny looked at us from the bathroom doorway with the curling iron in her hand. "We'll be back by noon," I told her. She said, "I'll have everything ready." I picked up the file. The Chatham County Courthouse is 12 minutes from the Harrington Hotel. We walked. It was that kind of October morning in Savannah where the air is cool but the light is warm and the Spanish moss moves very slightly in the oak trees along the squares and everything feels, against all reason, manageable. I had been in courtrooms since I was 24 years old. I had stood before judges in circumstances that were other people's worst days. I knew how to be still in a room where decisions were being made about things that mattered. I held the file under my arm and walked. Patricia was already in the courthouse when we arrived. She was seated in the hallway outside courtroom C with her own attorney, a man I didn't recognize, in a dark suit. Curtis sat 2 chairs down from her in his groomsman's clothes, which struck me as either tone-deaf or deliberate, and I filed that observation away. Patricia looked up when I came through the door. For 1/2 second, something crossed her face that was not anger and not triumph. It was the expression of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is only now understanding what irreversible means. Then her attorney leaned over and said something to her and she looked away. Daniel was not there. I had texted him at 8:15, "Your mother filed a restraining order this morning. I am handling it. I will see you at 2 o'clock. He had called me immediately. I had let it go to voicemail. Not because I didn't want to talk to him, but because I needed the next 90 minutes to be clean and focused, and the sound of his voice would have introduced a variable I couldn't afford. He left a voicemail that I would listen to later. He had also, Simone told me, called his own attorney in Charleston, who had called Simone's cell before we left the hotel. The message was simple. Daniel wanted it on record that he had no knowledge of and no involvement in the petition, and that he opposed it entirely. Simone had that documented before we walked through the courthouse door. Judge Reginald Beaumont was 61 years old, a compact man with reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead until he needed them and a reputation for impatience with procedural sloppiness. He came in at 10:32, sat down, and looked at both tables with the mild expression of a man who has seen everything and remains curious about very little. He asked Patricia's attorney to present the emergency grounds. The attorney stood and began to describe, in the practiced language of family court motions, a pattern of behavior by the respondent that constituted a credible threat requiring immediate judicial intervention. He referenced the affidavits. He referenced the urgency of the timeline. He used the phrase psychological well-being 3 times. Judge Beaumont let him finish. Then he looked at the petition over his reading glasses, which he had lowered for the occasion. He asked one question. He asked whether the petitioner had any documentation, records, communications, third-party corroboration, beyond the sworn affidavits of herself and one witness. Patricia's attorney said the affidavits were the documentation. Judge Beaumont looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at our table. He asked Simone if the respondent wished to be heard. Simone stood and said yes, Your Honor, and placed the file on the table in front of her. Simone spoke for 7 minutes. She was precise and unhurried. She outlined the timeline of Patricia Voss's conduct over the preceding 11 months, the unsolicited attorney consultation regarding the respondent's private trust, the fabricated venue complaint, the pressure campaign regarding the prenuptial agreement, the unverified professional misconduct allegation contradicted by a letter from the Georgia State Bar obtained the same day, the therapist claim, and the calls to the groomsman the previous week alleging financial motives without evidence. She referenced the supporting documentation for each item. She noted that the respondent's own fiancé had filed a statement through counsel opposing the petition and affirming no basis for the claims. She placed Daniel's attorney's letter on the record. Then she noted that the supporting affidavit from the second witness, Curtis Hale, contained no first-hand observations, only characterizations relayed to him by the petitioner herself, making it derivative rather than independent corroboration. She said the petition did not meet the evidentiary threshold for emergency injunctive relief and asked that it be denied. Judge Beaumont looked at the file for 1 minute and 40 seconds. I counted. Then he looked up. He said he had reviewed the petition and found it to be unsupported by the factual record presented. He said the affidavit evidence was insufficient to establish a credible threat warranting emergency relief. He said the petition appeared to be motivated by circumstances personal to the petitioner rather than by a genuine concern for the safety or well-being of any party. He denied the petition. He dismissed it with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled on the same grounds. The entire proceeding had lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Patricia's attorney was already gathering his papers. Curtis looked at the floor. Patricia sat very still with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the judge's bench. I watched her for the 3 seconds it took Simone to close the file and pick up her bag. In those 3 seconds, Patricia Voss looked like what she was, a 62-year-old woman who had spent 11 months constructing an elaborate architecture of interference and had just watched it dismissed in 4 minutes by a man who had 19 years of practice seeing exactly this kind of thing. She did not look at me. I did not need her to. Outside the courthouse, in the October morning, Simone and I stood on the steps for a moment. She said, "We need to get you back to that hotel." I said yes. She said, "How are you doing?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I'm getting married in 3 hours and my future mother-in-law just tried to have me legally barred from my own wedding and failed in 4 minutes." She looked at me. I said, "I'm fine." She laughed, once, short and real. Then we walked back through the squares toward the Harrington. I called Daniel from the elevator. He picked up before it finished the first ring. Mara. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has been sitting very still doing nothing for 2 hours because there was nothing he could do. I told him the petition was dismissed. I told him the judge denied it with prejudice. I told him I would see him at 2 o'clock at Forsyth Park under the arch of white flowers we had chosen together in August. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am so sorry." I said, "Daniel. You didn't do this." "She did." He said, "I know. I need you to know I know that." I said, "I know you do. I'll see you at 2. He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too. Wear the blue tie." Destiny had the dress steamed and hanging. She had moved the timeline and briefed the coordinator. She had ordered a second pot of coffee and a plate of fruit from room service and set them on the desk where Simone and I had been working 2 hours earlier. She had also, without being asked, placed a single gardenia in a water glass on the windowsill. Celestine had grown gardenias on Oleander Street. Destiny had known that for 11 years. I stood in the doorway of the bathroom and looked at the flower in the window and the October light behind it, and for the first time that morning I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief exactly, but the specific release of a person who prepared for the worst and is only now being given permission to feel the best. I got dressed. Forsyth Park at 2 o'clock on an October afternoon in Savannah is one of the most beautiful places on earth. The fountain was running. The live oaks made a canopy over the north end of the park and the light came through them in long slanted pieces and lay on the grass like something placed there deliberately. We had set up 200 white chairs in a semicircle facing a simple arch draped in white roses and eucalyptus and one branch of something with small orange berries that the florist had chosen and I had trusted her to choose. The guests were already seated when I arrived. Daniel was standing at the arch in his gray suit and the blue tie I had asked him to wear, and when he saw me come through the park entrance with Destiny beside me, something happened to his face that I will not try to describe accurately because I don't think language is the right tool for it. I will say only that he looked like a man who had been afraid of something all morning and was no longer afraid. I walked toward him through the October light and did not look anywhere else. Patricia was seated in the third row on the groom's side. She had come. I don't know what I expected, that she wouldn't, perhaps, or that the morning would have been enough to make her stay away. But she was there, in the yellow dress from the rehearsal dinner, with her hands folded in her lap in exactly the same posture they had held in the courtroom 3 hours earlier. Robert sat beside her. He looked at me when I passed and I saw in his face the same thing I had seen at the rehearsal dinner, shame, and something that had been there longer, something that looked like relief. His son was marrying a woman who could not be managed. I think Robert Voss understood, on some level, what a gift that was. The ceremony was 22 minutes long. We had written our own vows. Daniel spoke first. He said that he had spent most of his life learning to be what other people needed and that I was the first person who had ever asked him simply to be himself and meant it. He said he wanted to spend the rest of his life in a house where the truth was welcome and where the people inside it chose each other freely. He said he chose me freely. Completely. Every day. His voice did not break once. I said that my grandmother Celestine had told me once that the most important thing she could give me was options. I said I had understood that to mean financial security and professional independence, and it did mean those things. But standing here I understood that it also meant this, the option to be loved by someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway. I said Daniel saw me clearly. I said I was staying. I heard Destiny behind me make a sound she would later describe as allergies. When the officiant said you may kiss the bride, Daniel kissed me and the 200 people in the white chairs made the sound that 200 people make when something they have been hoping for finally happens. I held his face in my hands for a moment before I let go. Then I turned to face the park and the fountain and the October light, and I was his wife, and he was my husband, and in the third row Patricia Voss sat with her hands still folded in her lap and watched it happen. The reception was at a restaurant on Whitaker Street, a long room with exposed brick and candlelight and a band that played things people actually wanted to dance to. The food was extraordinary. The toasts were warm and funny and true. Simone, who had driven down from Atlanta to stand by in a courthouse and ended up staying for a wedding, gave a toast that made the room laugh and then go quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone says something they recognize. Patricia did not come to the reception. Robert did. He arrived quietly, sat at a table near the back with a glass of bourbon, and when Daniel and I made our round of the tables he stood up and shook Daniel's hand for a long time and then turned to me and said, in the careful voice of a man who has been choosing his words for 65 years, "You have more grace than this family deserves." I thanked him. He said he meant it. I told him I knew he did. He sat back down and finished his bourbon and left before 9 o'clock, and I have thought about that sentence many times since. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The fallout began the following morning. We were in the hotel for one more night before flying to Portugal for 10 days, and I was sitting on the balcony with coffee when Simone called. She said the Chatham County Court clerk had processed the dismissal and it was now part of the public record. She said Patricia's attorney had already called her office. He wanted to know if we intended to pursue any action arising from the filing. Simone had told him she would need to consult with her client. She was consulting with me now. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I looked at the rooftops of Savannah in the morning light and thought about it. Patricia had filed a false emergency petition containing fabricated characterizations of my conduct. She had induced Curtis to provide a derivative affidavit in support of it. The filing had caused me to spend the morning of my wedding in a courthouse. It had caused Simone to incur professional time. It had been dismissed with prejudice by a judge who had made clear on the record that it appeared to be motivated by personal rather than legitimate concerns. There were legal options available to me. Simone had outlined them before the hearing. They were real and they were viable. I held my coffee cup and thought about what Celestine would say. I thought she would say, "What are you trying to accomplish?" I thought about that carefully. Then I told Simone, "Nothing yet. Let it sit." She said, "Okay." She said she thought that was wise. She said the record spoke for itself. Daniel woke up an hour later and came out to the balcony and sat with me. We didn't talk about his mother right away. We drank coffee and looked at the city. After a while he said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. He said, "I spoke to my father last night at the reception." I said, "I know, I saw." He said, "My father told me that he has known for a long time what my mother does. That he has watched her do it to people his entire marriage. That he has never known how to stop it and has spent 40 years being ashamed of that." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He said he was sorry he didn't warn me sooner. About what she was capable of. I looked at Daniel's face. He looked like a man who had just been handed a piece of information that rearranges a great many other things. I took his hand. I said, "What do you need?" He said, "I need to understand how we're going to handle her going forward." I said, "Together. Clearly. With boundaries she can see." He said, "And if she doesn't respect them?" I said, "Then we enforce them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." Just like that. "Okay." We flew to Lisbon the following afternoon. 10 days in Portugal, which is a country that seems specifically designed to remind you that the world is large and beautiful and entirely indifferent to whatever has been happening in your particular family. We ate grilled fish in small restaurants and walked through old neighborhoods and sat in the evenings with wine on terraces above the river and talked about everything except Patricia Voss, because she had already taken enough of our time and we were not going to give her Portugal too. On the 4th day, Daniel received a text from Curtis. It said, "I should not have done what I did. I believed what I was told. That is not an excuse. I am sorry." Daniel showed it to me over breakfast. I read it. I told him what he decided to do with that friendship was entirely his own decision and I would support whatever he chose. He texted Curtis back 2 days later. The text said, "I hear you. Give me some time." That was, I thought, exactly right. On the 7th day, I received an email from Patricia. It was 4 sentences long. It said she had acted out of fear and that fear had led her to do something she could not undo. It said she understood if I never forgave her. It said she loved her son and she was trying to learn the difference between loving someone and controlling them and that it was harder than she had expected. It said she was sorry. I read it on the terrace above the river with a glass of white wine and the late afternoon light on the water. I read it 3 times. Then I saved it in a folder and closed my laptop and watched the light change on the river for a while. I did not respond that day. Or the next. Some things need time before you know what to do with them. I had learned that from a woman named Willa who moved to Portland without leaving her phone number, and from a woman named Ingrid who sat at a dinner table and waited until the moment was exactly right. I was in no hurry. We came home to Atlanta on a Tuesday. There was a card in the mailbox, handwritten, from Robert Voss. It was a wedding card, the simple kind, white with a small illustration of 2 birds. Inside, in his careful handwriting, it said, "Welcome to the family, Mara." I mean that differently than she meant it. I put it on the refrigerator. The weeks after we returned settled into the particular rhythm of a new life being arranged. We were looking for a house in the Kirkwood neighborhood, a craftsman bungalow with a back garden where I had already decided I would plant a fig tree. Daniel had begun, quietly and without fanfare, to answer his mother's calls every other day instead of every day. The first time he let one go to voicemail, he sat with his phone for a moment afterward and then put it face down on the counter and went back to what he was doing. I noticed. I didn't say anything. There are victories that belong to a person alone. 3 weeks after we returned from Portugal, Patricia called and asked if she could come to Atlanta for a visit. Daniel said he would discuss it with me and call her back. He asked me that evening what I thought. I told him I thought a visit was possible but that I needed certain things to be understood before it happened. He asked what things. I said, she needs to know that I am not a problem she is managing. I am his wife. I am the person he chose. And the next time she files a legal document with my name on it, I will respond in every way the law allows, and she should understand that I am very good at my job. Daniel looked at me. He said, should I tell her that in those words? I thought about it. I said, yes. Exactly those words. He called her back the following morning. I don't know exactly what was said. I know the call lasted 22 minutes. I know that when he came and found me in my office afterward, he looked tired in the particular way of someone who has just done something difficult and necessary and right. He said, she understood. I said, good. Then I made us both coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and made a list of houses to look at on Saturday, and that was that. 6 months after the wedding, I responded to Patricia's email. Not because I had forgiven her completely, I hadn't, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But because I had thought carefully about what I wanted my life to look like, and a permanent silence wasn't it. I wrote 4 sentences. I told her I had received her email and read it more than once. I told her I did not intend to pursue any legal action arising from the petition. I told her that Daniel and I had a life we were building on our own terms and that she was welcome in it if she could respect those terms. I told her the terms were simple, she was his mother, I was his wife, and neither of those things was a competition. She replied within the hour. She said, I understand. I'll try. I believed the trying more than I believed anything she had said in 3 years, because trying is honest in a way that certainty never is. Patricia came to Atlanta in the spring. She stayed 2 nights at a hotel 3 blocks from our house, which had been Daniel's quiet suggestion and which she accepted without argument, and that acceptance told me more than any apology could have. We had dinner together on the Saturday evening. The 4 of us, Daniel, me, Patricia, and Robert, who had driven up from Charleston because he said he wanted to be there. The conversation was careful and a little formal and occasionally warm, the way conversations are when people are learning new distances. Patricia asked about my work. She asked genuine questions and listened to the answers. At one point she said, almost to herself, "You really do know what you're doing?" I said yes. She nodded slowly. I think that was the closest she could come, that evening, to saying what she actually meant. I decided it was enough for now. I planted the fig tree in the back garden in April. A brown turkey fig, the same variety Celestine had grown on Oleander Street. It was small, barely 4 feet tall, with the particular tentative look of something that has just been asked to trust new ground. I stood in the garden after I planted it with dirt on my hands and thought about my grandmother and what she built and what she left me and how long it had taken me to understand the full shape of it. She had not just left me money. She had left me the education to protect it, the profession to understand it, and the temperament to wait until the moment was exactly right. She had left me options. I had used every one. My name is Delacroix Voss. I am 34 years old. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, in a craftsman bungalow in Kirkwood with my husband and a fig tree that is just beginning to take root. I am the woman my grandmother built. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.